Thanks. So the final presentation in this session is about some thoughts on dynamic unit disk graphs given by Neven Villani.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here to talk about the subject of dynamic unit disk graphs, which I'm working on with Arnaud Castet. I will first start with some definitions and reasons to study the problem, and then we'll go over the two-dimensional and one-dimensional cases. This is the main object.
The sound is very weak.
Is this better? I've tried. Okay. Can you hear me well now?
Better.
Almost,
okay.
Yeah.
So this is the main object that we'll be working on. It has been already encountered this morning by chance. A graph is said to be unit disk when its vertices can be embedded in the space in such a way that two vertices are linked if and only if they are close enough in the space. You can equivalently define this as vertices being mapped to disks which intersect each other if and only if the vertices are linked. Here are a few examples of graphs that are unit disk. In particular, the complete graph is always unit disk since you just have to put all the vertices close enough to each other. And here is one example of a graph that is not unit disk. The 5 first branches will not pose a problem, but as soon as you try to put in the 6th branch, there will be at least one of 2 unwanted connections which will appear. And so this opens the question of attempting to decide if a graph is unit disk or not. And this question has already been quite studied in the static case. But we are interested in attempting to find a temporal equivalent to unit disk graphs. And we define a dynamic unit disk graph as a sequence of graphs so that all graphs are UDG. And the embeddings vary in only limited ways from one instant to the next. In particular, most of our work so far has been devoted towards attempting to define what movements to allow in a way that is both physically reasonable and computationally tractable. We will call footprint the unit of all connections that ever exist. The problem of attempting to reconstruct the sequence of embeddings from just the sequence of contacts has already been studied a bit by a previous paper. But as you can see on these pictures, there are quite a few pairs of vertices that should be close enough to communicate given the reconstructed embedding, but that are not linked. And although this is a reasonable assumption in the case of imperfect measuring instruments, which could have missed some connections either way, we are interested in knowing how far we can go, assuming a perfect trace, assuming no opportunity for contact was missed. Here are some known results in the static case. In particular, the unrestricted problem being NP-hard means we can't expect better than that in the dynamic setting. But there are essentially 2 tractability results in the static case. One is for one is for caterpillars, and the other one is when the vertices are limited to being embedded into a single dimension. And what we've shown is that only one of these 2 results translates well to the temporal setting. We have not managed to find any reasonable restrictions that makes the problem tractable in 2-dimension, but we provide an algorithm, an efficient algorithm for the 1-dimensional case. Here's an overview of how to prove NP hardness for the dynamic unrestricted 2-dimensional case without using the proof of NP hardness for the static case, because there's an opportunity for extending this proof to other restrictions and for simplifying it. We simulate 3 SAT and we use one small group of disks for each variable, the one small group of vertices. In particular, this guarantees that the resulting reduction is polynomial with regards to the size of the input. And the key idea is that each variable, so each group of disks, will be able to take one of two possible configurations, which we interpret as true or false arbitrarily, and by some physical restrictions, which should be the baseline requirement for what movements to allow, which is basically we disallow teleportations and we do not want vertices to acquire an unbounded speed from one instant to the next. This will guarantee that once a variable has taken one of these two possible states, it will be unable to switch over to the other configuration. And so we will handle clauses sequentially over a period of a few snapshots. And this will guarantee that variables keep the same valuation over the whole lifetime of the graph. Here are the two configurations of variables in question. We will interpret the left one as true because the two extra blue disks are between the green disks, and the right one is false because the two blue disks are between the orange disks. This is absolutely arbitrary. Notice that these two configurations have the same contact trace, so they are indistinguishable from one another from the point of view of the inputs given to the algorithm. Here is how to assemble a clause. In particular, this clause here is not x1 or x2 or bottom. Notice that here both x1 and x2 are set to true. And in the case of a literal which appears negated in the clause, we connect its blue disks to the rest of the cycle. And in the case of a literal that appears unnegated, we connect its orange disks. And this guarantees that the two extra blue disks are on the outside of this 12 cycle, if and only if the literal is satisfied. By some packing arguments, which are also very much used a lot in the static proof, we can show that this 12 cycle is able to contain two pairs of blue disks, but not three. And so this clause is satisfied if and only if at least one, there exists an embedding for this clause if and only if at least one of the pairs of blue disks is on the outside of this 12 cycle. And so since we have this guarantee that variables do not change configuration from from the handling of one clause to the next, we can guarantee that a clause, that the whole formula is satisfied if and only if there exists an embedding for each clause. And so if and only if all clauses are satisfied. This is enough to show NP hardness in the general case, but remember that this was already a known result. What's interesting here is first that this is a much simpler proof than in the static case, in the sense both that it's shorter and that it uses a more general formulation of the initial problem and fewer disks. But more interestingly, we are able to adapt this proof quite easily to all of these modified constraints, which shows that the problem remains hard in different restrictions, some of which are either tractable or irrelevant in the static case. So even by restricting the coordinates, the problem remains hard. Restricting the footprint can only go as far as the static case can. Restricting the snapshots is basically useless, since even with just connected components of size 2, the problem remains hard, which you can interpret as the ability to simulate very complex structures from very simple snapshots by alternating which links are active at consecutive instants. And even with a restriction of a completely different nature, it remains hard. All of these constraints boast various difficulties in the static case, so at least a sizable portion of the hardness can be said to come from the added dynamicity. But perhaps even more interestingly, is that we are able to diagnose exactly where the difficulty comes from. And that is from the fact that structures can have several possible embeddings, but not all of these embeddings are compatible with future events. And what happens is that in the one-dimensional case, which we will see in just a second, we have a way to represent all possible configurations, all possible embeddings at once, and perform computations efficiently on this set of all embeddings. And this is possible thanks to a data structure which already existed to study the static one-dimensional case, but which we extend to handle temporality. Let's discuss the physical model a bit first. We said that we would assume a perfect trace. And in particular, one key assumption is that we are able to distinguish individual events. So individual connections between two vertices being created or destroyed. So the graphs change only in one connection from one instant to the next. And in order for there to be a physically plausible realization, we expect that there be continuous transitions from one embedding to the next that do not cause events to happen. So that from one embedding to the next, vertices are able to move continuously without any connection being modified, other than the one connection in question. These are two properties that we've been able to show, which essentially are here to allow us to put aside the physical model a bit. The first one tells us that orderings which we can find in embeds are exactly those in which all neighborhoods are contiguous. And so essentially it tells us in which ways sets of permutations can represent sets of embeddings. And the second one is that we can simulate continuous transitions by only exchanging vertices that have the same neighborhood. And so it gives us an easy criteria for which changes in the permutations to allow in order for the underlying transition, to respect the underlying physical model. And so thanks to these two properties, we will be able to focus only on manipulating sets of permutations. And we don't actually have to think about the underlying model, the underlying physical restrictions. Let's introduce the data structure that we work with. A PQ tree is a tree with two kinds of nodes. Q nodes represent two different families of permutations, one with their children in order and one with their children in reverse order. Since the children themselves can represent permutations, these are not just two permutations, but really two families of permutations. And P nodes represent all possible reorderings of their children. Here's a quick example. This PQ tree composed of one Q node and one P node represents all permutations that are either an arbitrary permutation of 1, 2, and 3, followed by 4, 5, 6, 7, or by flipping the Q node, 7, 6, 5, 4, followed by an arbitrary permutation of 1, 2, and 3. And so essentially P nodes represent vertices, represent an ordering which we have no information about. And Q nodes represents the fact that we know the relative ordering, but not the actual orientation. In particular, we use a set of these trees, which we call a PQ forest. And here is one example of a contact trace. So this is all one dimension. And one PQ forest, which could be associated to a possible history for this contact trace. There are a few informations to be taken from this. The first thing you may notice is that vertices share the same P node if and only if they have the same neighborhood. And secondly, these large Q nodes right above P nodes are usually representative of large connected components. And so essentially the lower portion of the tree represents information that currently holds on the contact trace. And the more you climb back up towards the root, the older the events you have access to. So essentially what this Q node being above this Q node indicates is that this vertex was separated from these vertices earlier in the lifetime of the graph than these two vertices were from this group of vertices. And so the data structure carries information not only about the current configurations, but also about some past events, some important past events, and the relative order in which they occurred. I will now walk you through two examples of what kinds of transformations to perform when a connection is either created or destroyed. They are by no means the general case, since there's a bit too many case analysis for me to show the general case in such short time. But you can expect the transformations performed here to be representative of the kinds of manipulations that you would perform during the execution of the algorithm. So here's how to react when a new connection between V and V prime is detected. In general, V and V prime would be in two separate subtrees, with some common ancestor not represented here. And between them and their nearest common ancestor is some tower of Q nodes.
Oh, sorry, Neven, quick comment. We don't see your cursor when you say here and here. We don't see it.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Well, okay.
Do you annotate anything?
No, I'm not writing anything.
Ah, okay, okay.
I will describe referring to the left and right. Thank you for the information. So in general, they would be in two separate subtrees, and they have some tower of Q nodes that separates them from their ancestor. The first step is to make them adjacent. And so notice that when performing this transformation from the initial configuration to the one after a rotation, the set of permutations represented by the forest has not changed, because the Q nodes in between already account for the fact that we have no information on whether or not their children were flipped around. Remember that I said that vertices share the same P node if and only if they have the same neighborhood. Well, the next step is to extract vertices from the P nodes that they used to be in. Because they no longer share the same neighborhood, since a new connection between the two will now be created. This finally, from the rotate step to the extraction state, this finally changes the permutations associated with the forest, which was not the case in the first transformation. And the final step is to flatten the whole structure, which essentially corresponds to rewriting history in a way that accounts for the new information brought in by these two vertices becoming adjacent. So between the first and the last step of this transformation, we've essentially filtered out all permutations that are incompatible with this newly detected connection. We filtered out all permutations in which V and V prime cannot be made adjacent. And remember, this was our criteria for which orderings are compatible with, which orderings can be found in embeddings. Let's see a link down now. The most interesting specific case is when V and V prime share the same neighborhood, but their neighborhood is otherwise empty. The first step is again to extract them from their P node, since they no longer share the same neighborhood as they used to. And in order to account for the fact that we have no information on which direction they went their separate ways into, we have to add this Q node in between in order to account for both possible orderings. It should come to no surprise that the steps I've just shown you can be performed in polynomial time, but in fact, with some efficient representation of neighborhoods, we can get down to log n amortized after each event. And so since the expected size of the input is the number of events times the log of the number of vertices, we can say this algorithm runs in polynomial time. Also interesting is that it is online. It only ever performs computations on what it's remembered from the past and the current event. And so it is suitable for applications where it would have to perform computations as events come in on the fly. That's everything I've prepared. There are still many unanswered questions, but if you have any questions, I'd be happy to provide more information. Thank you for your attention.